Hi, I'm Katie.
Hi, I'm Ali.
And welcome to Mostly Book Talk. We're really pleased to have with us today YA author Malcolm Duffy, and he's going to talk to us about his new book, Dead Straight Line.
We are delighted today to talk to Malcolm Duffy, who, for listeners who haven't come across your work before, this is your fifth novel.
That's right.
Yeah. We just want to hear a bit about the book and how it came into being.
Sure.
So should we start with how you got to become a novelist? Because you might have had a slightly circuitous route.
I have had an unusual route to this position as an author. I guess turning the clock back to when I was a young lad. Obviously, this was a time pre-internet, pre-mobile phones. I was living up in Newcastle with my mum and dad. And I was one of these kids. I loved going out on my bike. I like playing football, all the usual things. But if it was a wet day and there was nothing on TV, which normally there wasn't, I'd get a pen and paper out and just start writing. And I'd write little stories. And I've no idea really where this came from. And it's something that amused me, and I had no idea that I was ever going to get anything published. But in the same way that I guess some people like doing puzzles or whatever, I really enjoyed writing. And I've still got some of these little stories stashed away in a box somewhere. I think writing has always been part of my DNA. I'm just fascinated by the blank page and trying to create something where nothing existed. I guess it's the same with people who like painting or people creating music. Where there was nothing, you create something. And I got a real buzz out of it. So moving on a bit, I had a usual sort of school life and did okay at school. And I ended up going to university where I studied law, which seems like a slightly odd path to take. And to this day, I'm not quite sure why I studied law, but I did. And I quite enjoyed it, but it wasn't really scratching that creative itch, really. It wasn't really getting my creative juices flowing. So about halfway through my law degree, I thought, I need to try and find something else. And I bumped into this girl once, and she said, I'm doing a copywriting course. And I said, copyright, is that something to do with copyright law? And she said, oh no, copywriters, people who write ads. And I had this sort of eureka moment where I thought, that's me. I see these ads on the telly and posters and thought, I can't believe you can actually make a living doing that. So basically, that's what I've been doing most of my professional career, is coming up with ads for all sorts of products. You name it, I've worked on. And I've absolutely loved it. For somebody who likes coming up with ideas, it's brilliant that I actually get paid for coming up with mad stuff that comes on the TV and what have you.
Is that quite a discipline?
Very much.
Because you're basically writing presumably continually to a deadline and to a spec and just come up with another idea.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the briefs sometimes are very tight. There isn't that freedom that some people might think, that you don't just go away and come up with a mad idea, because a lot of clients have their style books, they have their rule books as to what you can and can't do. So if you have to write a 30-second radio commercial, it can't be 31 seconds, it's got to be 30 seconds. And the brief might include the product details and lots of, dare I say, boring stuff that you somehow try and weave in there, but with a bit of a creative twist in it. So I think it is a challenge, and it's one which I loved. But I think in a funny sort of way, advertising has really helped me become an author, because quite often what you get as a copywriter, you get given a brief for something that's really boring. It might be a tin of baked beans or Kellogg's cornflakes, and you've got to write a 30-second TV commercial. And you think, I somehow got to make this as exciting and engaging as possible and stand out from all the other ads. And I guess the same is true when I write a book. I think sometimes I'm writing about subjects from a theme. Some people might go, oh, I'm not sure about that. And it's my job as an author to use every trick in the book to make that as an engaging and memorable and as much of a page turner as I can. So I think advertising has sort of helped me over the years to, I guess, become a better writer. And then I had a good career in advertising, worked for big agencies, had my own agency for 10 years. But I think there came a point where I thought, I really want to write my own thing, to put something down on paper that's much more me. Because, as you mentioned, you're quite often working within quite strict briefs. And much as you can put some of your own creativity in there, it's still the client sort of calling the shots and telling you what you can and can't do. And I thought, going back to me as a little boy, I thought, I want that blank page again. I want to write what I want to write. I was actually working at Comic Relief. I was creative director there for 3 years, which was a really interesting job. And it was there that I had my idea for my first book, which was Me Mum, Me Dad, Me. And I was looking for an idea for a long time. And being at Comic Relief, you got to work with lots of charities and see where the money was spent. I remember we were down in Bath one day looking at a charity that dealt with domestic abuse, and looking at the women and the children who were being supported. And it was there I had this light bulb moment. I thought it would be interesting to write a book about domestic abuse, but from the viewpoint of not the woman, but a boy in the family who's seeing what's going on but doesn't quite understand it. And he goes in search of the dad to try and sort the situation out. I had the title, I had the idea, me, mum, me, dad, me. And I spent a year or two writing it, and finally came out in 2018 to critical acclaim, and it was one of Waterstone's books of the year. And I guess I was off and running, really.
Yeah.
And I guess what I hadn't imagined when I wrote that book, that I'd suddenly become an issue writer, that all my books, I just wrote a book, really, and not really thought much beyond that.
Well, we're going to ask partly why write for children, and also why have you gone for really difficult issues? Because all of your books have tackled quite difficult issues. Why focus on difficult issues?
Yeah, well, funny enough, I didn't even realize I'd written a YA book until I sent it off to my agent. And she said, I just wrote a book. And it was obviously written from the first person viewpoint of a 14-year-old lad in Newcastle. And she said, oh, this is perfect YA. And I said, really? He said, yeah, this is. So I'd written a YA book, unbeknownst to me. I just thought I'd written a story. And on it went. So I ended up with Zephyr, which looked after children and YA books. But the issue side of it really fascinates me, because sometimes people say, oh, would you like to write a fantasy book or some dystopian novel or whatever? And I guess I could. But I really like the challenge of trying to take like a tough issue, be it domestic abuse or the Ukraine war or whatever, and try and make that palatable and readable and entertaining and all of those things. I suppose it goes back to me being an advertising copywriter, to take something that's a bit tricky, if you like, and turn it into something that is, dare I say, enjoyable to an audience that might not at first value think it is enjoyable. Not to say I'd never write a fantasy book or dystopian, any of the categories, but I really quite like looking at things that are real, and I like the research side of it, and I like finding out about subjects that are happening in the world, like the Ukraine war or dyslexia or whatever that may be. I really enjoy that side of it. I do a lot of research to make sure that my books are true, and I'd also feel a sense of responsibility to the people who are writing about. When I'm writing about the Ukraine war, I'm writing about refugees and real Ukrainians, some of whom are going to read the book. So I need to reflect that in a way that's true. And I'd hate people to go, oh, that's just made up, or that would never happen, or do you know what I mean? So I'm very cognizant of that when I'm writing my stories, that anyone reading this will know that I've done my homework and that the story rings true and it isn't just made up, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's interesting with this book, this theme, how did this one come about?
Yeah, dead straight line, because I'm up to book 5. Luckily, there are still a lot of issues out there. And a lot of people have asked me, how do you write a book? And people say, where do you start? And it's only recently that I've actually given an answer to that. And I guess I've got 2 things that I'd say. One is find a theme that you're fascinated by, that you really, really want to write about, whatever that is. And I think the reason that is you're going to spend a long time, 6 months to a year or maybe longer, writing about it. So it better be something that grips you. And number 2 is to find a problem. Because all books, all films are problem-based. Everything is. But make it an interesting problem, not just like with this case of Mammy, Dad, Me, not just a case of a boy trying to deal with his mum's domestic abuse, which clearly is a problem, but he's got to find his dad, and no one will tell him where his dad is. He doesn't even know who he is. Now, that makes the problem more interesting, because it gives the story a bit of a twist. And I try to do that with all of my books, make that problem as interesting as I can. So with this book, Dead Straight Line, I was thinking, what subjects appeal to me? What am I fascinated by? And I started thinking about risk and the risks that people take. And it's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that men are far bigger risk takers than women on just about every parameter you can think of, be that driving or sex or drink or drugs, or they've even done things crossing the road. They've actually filmed people crossing the road, and men take more risks when a car's coming than women do. And there's something about the way that the male brain is hardwired to, I don't know, not necessarily get a buzz out of risk, but maybe there's a sense of infallibility or what have you. But I was fascinated by this, why some people take risks and some people don't. And I started again thinking about my own life and the risks that I took. And sometimes when I've given talks in places, there was one incident particularly up in Newcastle when I was a young guy and should have known better. And I took 3 risks on the same day. One, I drank too much, was in Newcastle at the time, was about half the course. Number 2, I got into a car with my friend and he'd been drinking, stupid thing. And number 3, I didn't wear my seatbelt. And he crashed into a parked car going down a steep hill in Newcastle. And I went through the car windscreen. Luckily, I wasn't blinded. I could have been, but my head's still numb to this day. I was off work for 5 months. So it was a very risky, stupid thing to do. But funnily enough, I didn't want to write about car crashes. Unfortunately, they're in the news a lot, and it's nearly always quite often young men showing off or whatever. I wanted to find something a bit more unusual. And again, I trawled back to my actually my teenage years, when I remember I was with a friend of mine, Andrew, and we were in town once, and he said, "Oh, well, we're going to head back to my house." And I said, "Oh, that's good." And he said, "Yeah, but we're not going to use the pavements and we're not going to use the roads. We're going to go in a dead straight line." I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through people's front and back gardens and whatever's in the way." So we did this very stupid game, and it was very scary and exhilarating, and we got shouted at a few times and a few minor cuts and bruises. And I thought that is what's going to be at the center of the story, because it's believable. It's the sort of thing young guys would do, but it's got that element of risk that things can go horribly wrong, which is what happens in this particular story with Rory, where he comes up with this game to amuse himself and his friends. But for one of his friends, it goes drastically wrong. And that's what the story's about, not just the risk, but the consequences of that risk and how one mistake can lead to a huge ripple effect and have a huge impact, not just on yourself, but your family, your friends, and all those around you. And it's something that as soon as I thought about it, I thought that's got to be the good basis of a book.
Yeah.
And off I went.
I'm really intrigued that the game comes from a real experience. It does feel like something only a teenage boy could think up, I have to say.
Exactly, yeah. Well, someone who'd either been taking too much drink or drugs or whatever. It's one of those stupid things that I guess people do to amuse themselves that I used to do when I was a young guy. And funny enough, not just a teenager, but into my early 20s as well. But I should have known better. It's funny how it is a particularly male thing to do this sort of thing. I can't imagine too many young women doing that. I'm sure there are some who would, but it's definitely a male thing, which again, I find quite fascinating.
And it's born out of the nothing else to do, isn't it? That hanging around and that sense of we need to find something to entertain ourselves, and what are we going to do today?
Exactly.
It's also that moment, isn't it? I think, I don't know whether there's research about this, whether women do take a beat, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. They take a pause for breath. And I don't know whether there's that peer pressure thing that isn't so prevalent among women, that the guys, maybe it's a macho thing or whatever, that somehow they have to step up to the plate and not seen to be a chicken or to hold back. Whereas, as you say, a young woman, a woman might say, "Do you know what, that's crazy," or "I'm going to take a breath here. That's a stupid thing to do." Whereas I think guys sometimes can feel that peer pressure to, I've got to step up, I've got to man up and do whatever that crazy thing is.
And it's a great idea because it's simple in its understanding, and it's a really straightforward idea of a game to understand.
Yes.
But there's just so many variations of what could go wrong in terms of how it works out.
Exactly, yeah. And well, funny enough, in an original earlier draft, I thought, should someone die? Because they could easily die. Someone could fall through a greenhouse, they could sever an artery. There's lots of ways you could actually die taking a shortcut. But actually, my agent dissuaded me from that. She said, no, it's far better if something happens and that person is still alive. And actually, it was totally the right call, because once someone's dead, unfortunately, they're dead. And then not to say there won't be huge ramifications of that, but that's the end of that person's story. And I think it was the right decision to make, that it wasn't something that was going to be as sudden and final as a death, but something that was going to be an injury that was going to live on.
Yeah. So I think it probably helps to just explain a bit about what happens, because it happens quite early on in the book. We worried about the spoiler, but there is a sort of key event that happens quite early on in the book where Rory has dared, really, his girlfriend's younger brother, who he's supposed to be sort of taking care of, hanging out with his mates, and he pressures him into playing this game. And the worst thing that could happen does happen, and he goes over too high a fence and lands badly and ends up being seriously injured and paralyzed. And it's the ramifications of that, isn't it? And it's really complicated because it's all part of quite a complicated set of relationships that you've set up there. And Rory isn't necessarily that likable, is he? Was that deliberate? And
I wanted to create a sort of anti-hero in a funny sort of way. You've got this guy who's quite full of himself. He's a bit of a Jack the Lad. He's sort of leader of this particular gang. He is just a bit full of himself, and he obviously disobeys his parents in the same way that I'm sure some young men do. But I didn't want to make him out to be a total villain or somebody that was so self-centered that they didn't feel about other people. What I really wanted more than anything was to have an absolute shock to this guy who, from where everything had gone right, and I'm sure that happens to a lot of people, that they'll get away with something so long and suddenly something goes horribly wrong. And basically the whole world turns on him because he's paralyzed, his sister's brother, and he's going to spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And the whole ramification of that he's brought this not just upon himself, but upon his family. And what will his family and friends think about that? His relatives, his mates all start disappearing. So this huge ripple effect that goes like more of a ripple, more of a tsunami, really, that goes through his life. In a split second, he is completely ostracized or cancelled. And really, that's what I want the story to be about, as to how can he, in any possible way, rebuild his life? Because he can't turn the clock back. He can't bring Yale back in. He's never going to walk again. So how is he going to deal with this terrible situation? And will anyone forgive him? I guess that's a situation. When and if can someone forgive him? And I guess that's one of the big themes of the book is forgiveness, because I think we do live in a sort of blame culture at the moment where it's very easy to criticize and ostracize and people are written out, so to speak. At what point can you go, do you know what? I think they've suffered enough. I think they've made a mistake. They've apologized for it as much as they ever can. But you have to somehow find it in yourself to forgive them, really. And that was an interesting thing to write in the book with all the different characters. And they all look at Rory through slightly different lenses, depending on who they are and their view of what he's done. And for me as a writer, that was a sort of fascinating thing to explore, that whole thing of blame and forgiveness, really.
And the blame in a sort of social media environment.
And all the hate that comes through. I didn't want the whole story to be all about mobile phones, and obviously they play a part in it, but obviously they will have his haters. His parents take his phone off him, which they probably would do at that time. And when he finally gets it back, as you can imagine, it's filled all with hate and rumors and gossip and goodness knows what, and lies and half-truths, which again, I think is true of social media a lot of times, that people hear a little bit of a story and make up the full thing themselves. So, but I didn't want the whole story to be all about social media. I think it plays a part, but not the whole part, because it wasn't brought about by social media, but it plays a part, and it shows the power of the mobile phone, really, certainly in the lives of young people.
How did you try and make people care about him? How hard was that? Because it was interesting, because when I first started reading him, I just thought he's quite annoying.
And I deliberately, most of my characters in the book aren't annoying, and they're always the victims in a funny sort of way. And in a way, this guy, Rory, is the opposite of that. I think I wanted it to be a slow burn. I didn't want overnight to have this sort of road to Damascus moment where something incredible happens. And I think it very slowly occurs, I think particularly when you meet the older character in the book, Tanker, who in some ways is the opposite of Rory, but in some ways he's very similar to him, because he's had an incredibly tough life and lots of things have gone wrong for him. And I think this is a real eye-opener for Rory, because I think he's feeling very sorry for himself, clearly, and the world is against him. And he finally meets this person for whom very little has gone right in their life. His marriage is broken up, and he was a veteran in the Falklands War. And I wanted him to be aware that there are other people in the world who are having far bigger problems than he ever has, yet somehow getting on with it. And I think for me, that was an important part of the book, that there had to be a moment, but it had to be quite gradual, where Rory realized that there were much, much bigger problems in the world than the one he was facing, although all he could think about, in his small world, was him and his problems. That there were lots of other people out there dealing with much bigger things than I guess that he'd ever have to deal with himself. And I guess also was the relationship of Yale, the boy, and his feelings, because I think it needs, at the end of the book, and for those who haven't read it, some sort of closure between those two, because obviously Rory has brought this upon Yale, and could Yale ever find it in himself to forgive him? And I think that is central to the whole thing. And it's all about, I think, Rory trying to find peace of mind at the end of it. I don't like stories that end in a way where everything is wrapped up. I like it to be a little bit open-ended, because I think life is like that. And I think my books are all like that. They don't come to a final conclusion. But I'd like to think that Rory finds some sort of peace within himself in amongst all this chaos and all these haters, if you like.
Yeah,
I really like Tanker.
No, yeah. Oh, he's very cantankerous. Yeah, he's a fun character. Yeah, and again, loosely based on a person that I managed to track down who was a Falklands War veteran, an amazing character, who was actually shot by the Argentinian in the fight for Mount Longdon, who was an amazing character. But yeah, I really enjoyed writing him, and he was a sort of a devil-may-care character, very much older than Rory, but with just a different view of life, and very much done there, seen that, got the T-shirt sort of character. But yeah, he was fun to write.
And you got to put a bit of your
on my
Georgian.
Yeah, always managed to squeeze a bit of Newcastle in there. Apart from my book about the Ukraine war, which I don't think there are many Geordie Ukrainians. I think there's a Geordie element in all my books, and I quite like doing that because I think it's probably an area slightly underrepresented in books. I know there are authors from the Great North, that's from the Northeast, but there probably aren't too many books with a Geordie accent in. So I think where relevant, I'll always sneak one in.
Yeah, I think you have to be a Geordie to write a Geordie accent because I think it's...
Yeah. And he's quite broad, Tanker. I've made him broader than some of my other ones because I think my publisher one story was saying, "Can you tone it down a bit?" And I thought, no, I'm going to turn this up. I'm going to turn the volume up. Yeah.
But he does add a bit of humour there as well. Yeah. There's the quest for crisps. It's a mixture of quite eventful, but also just funny, and it lightens it up a bit. So there is that sense it's never going to end well.
I really believe in having humour in all of my stories. There's a quote, I think it was Graham Greene once said, "When a situation is overwhelmingly serious, the only thing to do is laugh." And I think there's some truth in that. And I think a lot of soldiers and military people have got a very sort of sense of black humour. But I really like that in my books. There are certain books that I think maybe can only have one tone, but can be a bit depressing. And I think with the people who read my book, young adults, and adults, I like to sugar the pill where necessary or where relevant. Obviously, I have to be careful that I don't diminish the story or get the tone wrong. But I think where I can, I will always put humour or twists that I've got a bit of a comedic side, because I think that, for me, that reflects life as well. Even in the darkest moments, sometimes there can be room for humour and laughter.
Yeah. No, it did make me laugh. I did cry quite a lot reading this book, I have to say, but I did laugh as well. So it does bring both bits. You did a lot of research for the book, and obviously Tanker, you mentioned, was a Falkland veteran and had complex PTSD, and you worked with combat stress, but you also worked with the Spinal Injuries Association.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to a young person who had suffered a spinal injury. Obviously, there are people who are born and have to be in a wheelchair from early days, but I wanted someone who'd had that sudden moment, a bit like Yale. And I spoke to a guy from the Spinal Injuries Unit who'd had a terrible accident. I think he was only about 20 when he was in Thailand, and he came off a scooter. And to this day, he doesn't know what happened, but he was by the side of the road and he'd seriously damaged his spine, and there had to be an air ambulance, flew him back. And again, his story was amazing because he said, "Here I am, like a 20-year-old guy, couldn't move. My whole life is gone." He imagined he went into sort of deep depression. He said he had amazing support from his family and all the experts around him. But he said it was really tough to begin with, to deal with that thing, that knowing that he was never going to run again. But what was amazing to hear was that he'd come through the other side of it now, and I think he's going to get married, and he's got his own flat, and he's got a job now, and that life will look so much better. But I can imagine for a lot of people in that circumstance, there's that moment in time when you think, that's it, my life was over. He was a great example of someone who's come through all that and was incredibly positive, and is now a great advocate to help other people in similar circumstances who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in a wheelchair. But I think the world is getting better in that regard. The Paralympics, I think, has helped massively in that respect to raise the profile of people who have various injuries, and how sport can be a big way back into getting back into your fun and involvement in society again. But Dave was amazing. But I also had my own experience of my mum, and that came as a bit of a shock to us because in her later life, she spent the last 2 years of her life in a wheelchair. She lost the use of her legs, and she'd been a very mobile woman. She loved walking. She was a huge walker, but her limbs just stopped working. And that came obviously as a huge shock to us. But just the simplest things were the hardest things, because she wasn't the biggest woman, but just trying to get her into a car was just like, my brother's a really big guy and I'm reasonably strong, but just the smallest things were difficult. And thinking, can we go to this restaurant or can we go to this pub, and have they got wheelchair access? And I mentioned some of that in the book, even just simple things like a little curb. To us, it's no problem at all, but if you're in your wheelchair, how do you get up that curb and how can you do it? And we found that with my mum. Unfortunately, she had to go into a care home, a bit like Tanker, because the house she was living with, my sister, it was just unusable. She couldn't actually get the wheelchair into the toilet, and the rooms are too small. And I think that happens to quite a few people, that the houses just aren't fit for purpose. And the only place they can go to is a care home, which has got wider corridors and what have you. But so, there was a learning experience there from my mum as well.
Yeah, I think it was interesting with Yale that although you didn't shy away from the life-changing impact of the injury, he was, no, I wouldn't say positive, but he refused to be disempowered by it.
Yes.
And there was just a sense that he was going to get on with things.
Yes.
And I suppose because you could have made it very disempowered and helpless and about things that were happening to him, whereas actually he had agency. And I think that was quite important, really, in terms of representing that. It wasn't just this had happened to him and he was just not an active player in responding to it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think what I wanted Yale to be like, and I'm sure it happens with a lot of people, is that they want to get on in their life. And actually the impact is more on those around them, and especially his sister. And I can imagine there'll be circumstances where that does happen, where one person says, this has happened to me, I've just got to get on with it. Yet the other person who it hasn't happened to can't accept that. They can't have that sense of closure. And I thought, again, that was a really interesting dynamic. There's one particular scene where all three of them meet outside Yale's house, and Lauren really can't come to terms with what has happened. Yeah, her brother has, and she can't let go, and he has. And I think, again, that was, as a writer, that was really something really interesting to explore.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that happens quite a lot in life as well, that the person that something's happened to has moved on, but the people around them really struggle to.
Exactly. Yeah. I suppose it's like when someone's sick, that person, however sick they are in hospital, whatever, I guess they feel to some sense, I've just got to get on with it. But that person watching, their relative or friend, somehow suffers, but in a different way, because they don't want to see that person suffering. But the person who is suffering, I've just got to get on with it. There's nothing else I can do. Yeah. But there's almost that sense of feeling that they really want to help, but they don't know how to. I'm sure we've all been in a situation with someone that we know and love has been suffering, or they've got something over in hospital. And in that sense of lacking power, that there's nothing you can do apart from feel sorry or sometimes angry as to what's happened to them. And again, I think I really wanted to explore that side of it.
At the center of it is this whole question of both blame, shame, guilt, all of those really tricky issues that we just seem to be dealing with across the board. What were the kind of main things that you were grappling with there and you wanted people to take away and think about? Because it is very much a book that sits with you and you take away and think about, isn't it?
Empathy is a big thing, and a lot of my books have been chosen for their level of empathy. And I think that is at the heart of the story, in the same way that you think, what is life like in that person's shoes? And what, there but for the grace of God went I, both from Rory's viewpoint as to what he's done to Yale, but from other people's viewpoints, that I think in the heat of the moment, people can often say, you're to blame, you made this mistake, but to what extent is he blameworthy? And I love that, because things are rarely black and white, that there is elements of Yale played a part, and yes, something did go wrong, but was he deliberate in doing that? And how much did he push him into it? And how much was he cajoled into it? And I love exploring those sort of grey areas of guilt. And I think Rory goes through that himself, that at least he doesn't see himself as guilty as other people see him. And I'm sure that can happen a lot in life. I'm sure we can all relate to that when we've done something and someone is angry with us and go, yes, I did a bad thing, but it's not as bad as you think it is. And I personally don't carry that guilt in the way that you'd like me to. And I think, again, that was a really interesting thing to explore with someone like Rory, because this moment has really ruined his life to a large extent, and not in the way that it has with Yale, but it has. He's lost his friendship and issues with his girlfriend and his family. So yeah, I just think that the whole area of blame is a really fascinating one. And we see it play out on social media where somebody does something or says something, and I know that cancel culture seems to have quietened down a little bit. The heat seems to have come off that, but I know it wasn't so long ago when writers were being cancelled for writing about people they shouldn't have been writing about, and I think that people were treading on eggshells quite a lot. Yeah. I think it's still there to some degree, but I think it's perhaps a bit less than it was. I think politicians get it all the time. There are always people calling for heads, and you go, yeah, to what extent are they guilty, and to what extent do you have to take the ultimate sacrifice by resigning? And again, that's quite a fascinating thing that we say played out in the political field almost every day. But it can happen in personal lives as well, and almost the extent to which, what can Rory do about it? The mistake is gone, it's gone past. How can he ever make up for what has been and gone? And I think these, as a writer, these are all fascinating things to explore, the nuances of it. And again, I don't like to give people the answers. I like people to make their own mind up as to, and some people will, as to how guilty or how bad people think Rory is. And again, if you have half a dozen people, they might all have slightly different views on that. But to me, that's what a book should be about.
And I think what's really clever about it is that it's not just about Rory and Yale. Nobody is blameless in that book. The way they've reacted and the assumptions that they've jumped to, or the things that they've done because of what they decided has happened.
Yes.
They all come out of it slightly differently, and all are forced to perhaps rethink what they thought about and how they responded, right down to the head teachers. It's always good to put head teacher in a tricky
always
position.
Like to have a bit of that. There's always quite a bit of that in my books, is to not exactly get their comeuppance, but that, because also schools are an interesting one as well. To what extent schools have to take responsibility when something goes bad? Is it their responsibility to make that pupil better or get rid of them? And I'm sure there is that viewpoint. If you've got a bad apple in the school, it's going to affect others. You need to get rid of him. Or the reverse view is, no, it's our duty to look after that child. And I'm sure these debates go on in the schools on a daily basis.
So there's masses in it. And if people think that they've heard about what happens in the story and have read the blurb, there is a big twist at the end. It's got all of that as well. So you will cry, you will laugh, and you won't necessarily see exactly where it's all going.
And are there some writers that you've looked to when writing for young people that have shaped your writing at all?
Yeah, I'm reading all the time. I love Sarah Crossan's books. I'm reading her new book at the moment, her thriller. I love her. I know she writes in a completely different style to me, but I just love her sense of detail. And there's always so much emotion in her stories as well. I'm sure you probably read one, and they're just jam-packed full of emotion and insight. And they're just so sparse, yet so cleverly written. And I think I write in a very sparse way as well.
You do, yeah.
And I like to write that way. I'm not a hugely descriptive writer. I'm not nothing against that. And writers are brilliant. So there are some people who walk across a room and they'll spend 2 pages writing about it, whereas I will just have the person walk across the room and get on. And I really like that sparse style of writing. The other writer I really admire is Matt Haig. I think he's not only a great YA author, he's a great adult author. And again, all of his books are very different, and he uses humor, I think, to a fantastic effect in all of his books. And he's got a very distinctive style. I try not to ape other authors, but I think every time I read a book, whoever it is, I try to up my game, because sometimes you read a great book and go, blimey, that's brilliant. Not that I need to try harder, but I need to look at things a bit more differently, or sometimes think, I need to put more effort into that, or put more into the emotional, put more into the dialogue, or whatever. That's the thing with books. There's always room for improvement. There's a quote I quite often use, which is, a work of art is never finished, only abandoned. And I think that is so true of writing, that I often say when I give talks, I say, I don't read my books once I finish them. I've been through them, because I know I will find tiny little things that annoy me, that 99.9% of people won't even notice, but I will. And I go, why did I have that slight repetition there? Or that could have ended slightly differently. I guess as a writer, you beat yourself up. So yeah, that's what we do.
I think it's really interesting you first mentioned Sarah Crossan, because when I first started reading the book, I had this thing of, is it in verse? Because it is very sparsely written. I wonder whether this comes from your copy editing background.
Yeah, possibly.
Every word really earns its place. So it's a bit like a verse novel in that it is quite a fast read, because they're quite short sentences and you move through quite quickly. Is that a style that has just come from what you're used to, or is it something that you've deliberately tried to do because of the audience that you are aiming at?
I think a bit of both, really. Some of it is, it's a style of writing which I like. I like things to have a certain pace to them. And I'm also very cognizant of the audience I'm aiming at, which is young adults. And they want things a bit faster paced and shorter chapters. But funny enough, I think I've also learned a lot, because I've done a bit of screenwriting in my time and I've written a few short films. I think I've actually learned a lot from screenwriting, and I think other writers can. And I'll just give you one example. I remember once somebody said, any scene in a film, whether it's 5 seconds or 5 minutes, must do one of two things. You must either learn something about the character or move the plot along. And I've never forgotten that. Sometimes I'll write a piece and think, have I actually moved anything on here? Has the pace picked up, or have I just got people talking? And I think you can learn a lot from, because screenplays are basically stories, but in a shorter time length, and they are very condensed. And I think in the few screenplays that I've written, you're always condensing, and I feel that's what writing's all about. It's almost, I guess, when you're baking and you distill something down and you distill it and get it richer and richer. But yeah, I do like things to be short and punchy. I'm sort of averse really to not really long paragraphs, but sometimes someone will send me an email and they haven't broken it up. And even just the way something looks on a page, I sometimes go, that is so indigestible. I'll sometimes open a book in a bookshop and go, I can't read that. Not that my eyesight's bad. It's just too dense. It is just, I guess it's the way that some people write. But I like something that's going to be amenable and reachable, and sometimes just blocks and blocks of words. I just think, why couldn't they have broken it up? Could they not have had a few? But maybe that's just my personal thing. But
that also, Malcolm, leaves space for your own imagination, doesn't it? To kind of
exactly,
put the background of the story in.
Yeah, the less you say, the better. And sometimes what you leave out is as important as what you put in. And I think sometimes when I'm writing a story, I'll go, do you know what? I'm not going to explain that. I'm going to leave that to the reader. And I think readers are intelligent. So you can put way too much stuff in. You can put too little in as well. You can make people so confused they just don't know what's going on. But it's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's not been out very long, but have you been in schools with it? Have you had...
No, I'm about to. Yeah, I've got my first school visits coming up in the next few weeks. I've got lots of schools knocking on my door saying, when can you come in?
I bet you have, yeah.
It's a tricky time of year for schools because they've got exams. So a lot of them want me to use the halls, but of course the halls are all used for exams. So it's a bit of a tricky sort of time of year. Some of them may, in sort of July time or late June, have some free space in the halls, but it's all about finding that space. And obviously, yes, I could go in and do smaller classes, which I have done, but I think they prefer it when I can do a whole school year and I can have 300 or 400 people in the schools. But I will be
You'll have a busy autumn.
I will definitely have a busy autumn. I've got lots of schools.
So you've had a wide range of amazing reviews and lots of adults talking about how great it is. Have you had any feedback from young people yet?
I haven't as yet, but I guess I will be very soon because I'm going to go out there and be speaking to people who have read the book, because a lot of adults have read it and the reviews have been amazing. But I'm really keen to know what the core target audience, the young adults, make of it, especially boys, to see if I've hit the nail on the head. I'm very excited to hear that.
Yeah, we were going to ask about that because apparently boys are the hardest audience. It's one of the themes of the National Year of Reading that boys are the ones who are least likely to read. Do you consciously write with them in mind?
Yeah, funny enough, my publisher likes me to write with them in mind, although the book 7 Million Sunflowers is written from the viewpoint of a Ukrainian girl. And I think for me, it was right for that book. But yeah, I like writing from a male perspective because I am one myself. I remember what it was like. Yeah, I've got no issue with that because I guess there are more books written by women and for women. So again, I think anything that I can do to be different, whether it's setting things on the Northeast or with a Geordie tone of voice or from a male perspective, has got to be good. And again, I see it as a challenge because I know young men don't like reading quite so much. So I guess it's my mission, should I wish to accept it, is to try and write the sort of book that a young adult male will really enjoy and find a page to, and hopefully get them away from their mobile phone for a few seconds and go, do you know what, this is really enjoyable. Because I found that from my other books, I've heard great feedback from librarians and students themselves. Some have said, I've never read a book before and I absolutely love this. And I didn't realize there were books like this. Well, I take it as a big compliment that I've written in a tone of voice and in a style that they like and find engaging. So yeah, and hopefully those comments will be coming back for this. I hope so. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Absolutely. Fingers crossed. Because this is always the thing with authors. Whatever you're working on now is not necessarily what you're going into the world to talk about. So is there something in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on a new book already. I tended to leave myself a bit of a breathing gap and just enjoy the launch of this book and do the visits and what have you. But an idea came to me a couple of months ago that I couldn't shake off. And I've always found that's a good sign. So I've started writing that and plotting it. I'm in the middle of plotting. In fact, sometimes I can't stop myself writing the first few chapters because sometimes I just do. And I might well change them further down the line. But I really enjoyed those first few chapters and I'm just really plotting it. And I need to do quite a lot of research. And I thought, I'm not going to write any more until I've done my research because it's probably going to inform me as the way the characters behave and what they do. And so I've got another call with someone next week to do some more research. But yeah, I'm very excited by it. Who knows when it'll be out, but yeah.
And then you're back into this world to talk about it in the...
hopefully. Yeah, hopefully. And also I'm keen to write an adult book as well. So yeah.
Okay.
So watch this space. Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
No, it's great talking to you, Katie and Ali.
Hope you enjoyed that. We had a bit of a chat about boys and girls and risk, whether girls take less risk than boys. And we all kind of agreed on that. But I don't know, reflecting on it, whether that's a bit of an old-fashioned view. Be interesting to know what other people think.
I think girls just grow up more at that age. Or maybe they just take different risks. They do feel more sensible at that age than boys do. I don't know. You've had a teenage boy.
Well,
I haven't.
I can't say those things, yeah. I think it feels as a parent that that's true.
Yeah.
That boys might just get into trouble for no good reason, just by being daft.
Yeah. It's not as thought through. So girls, I think, do take risks, but I think they're more calculated, or they've thought about them more. But it just feels like boys, it is a bit as in the book. Well, there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
So we're going to invent our own fun a bit. But it's not a bleak book.
No, not at all. I mean,
it could have been, but it's not. And it's great to have books that are about that age teenage boy, because then they're not the most common topic to have books about, really.
No, they're not.
And hopefully it will appeal to that readership, because they're also not well known for reading. I think it's one of those books that I feel that I could recommend it to people who would not necessarily see themselves as being enthusiastic readers, but I think they would enjoy and engage with that book.
Yeah, definitely.
Because when we search around for books to recommend to year 8, 9 boys, it's difficult. But I think it's also a book that girls would enjoy. There are lots of books that teenage girls will enjoy and you can recommend to them. There are fewer books that teenage boys will enjoy. And this one, I think, would be enjoyed by both.
Yeah, I think so.
Did you want to flag another YA book?
The other book that I've just read is The Boy I Hardly Know, which is by Lisa Heathfield. It's published by Anderson, I think.
Yep.
That was really interesting. It's a tricky book in that it's about 2 sisters who are fostered, and the older sister is clearly taking risks, actually, having just said girls take
risks. Yeah.
And she is excluded from school and moved at no notice out of her foster home into a more restrictive regime where she's effectively locked up with other children. They go out to school, but it's a locked door kind of policy. And she meets a boy who she gets on with really well, and they run away together, ostensibly to find her sister, and the kind of experience of what happens. And actually, in some ways, it feels much older than Dead Straight Line, because the risks they're taking, anyway, you need to read it, but the risks that they're taking could have had very fatal consequences.
Right. Okay.
And it's really well written, it's really well put together, and you will cry.
Oh, okay. I've got that to look forward to.
Yeah, but it's really worth a read. And again, they felt like voices you don't hear very often.
Sounds good. Okay, brilliant. Well,
see you next time.
See you next time.